The kitchen was the true heart of every black household in the 1970s. It was where grandmothers passed down generations of recipes without ever measuring a single ingredient, where mothers worked miracles turning modest groceries into feasts that fed extended families, and where children learned that food was never just about eating. It was about love, heritage, and survival. These kitchens did not have granite countertops or stainless steel appliances, but they had something far more valuable. Tools that had been tested through decades of Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, and everyday meals that nourished both body and soul. Walking into any black kitchen during this era, you would find certain items that were not just cooking equipment. They were cultural artifacts, silent witnesses to the resilience and creativity of black families. What made these items so essential? Let us revisit 20 kitchen staples that defined black culinary tradition in the 1970s. 1. The seasoned cast iron skillet. In every black kitchen, the cast iron skillet was not just cookware. It was a family heirloom. These heavy, dark skillets, often passed down through generations, had developed a seasoning so perfect that nothing would stick to them. Grandmothers guarded these skillets fiercely, teaching younger family members the sacred rules. Never use soap, always dry it immediately, and keep it oiled. The skillet could fry chicken to golden perfection, bake cornbread with crispy edges, and sear pork chops that practically melted in your mouth. The sound of hot grease popping in that cast iron skillet meant Sunday dinner was underway. It meant fried chicken, smothered pork chops, or salmon croquettes were coming. The skillet retained heat like nothing else, creating that perfect crust that made black Southern cooking legendary. Children learned early not to touch it when it was on the stove. That handle stayed hot long after the burner was turned off. This was more than a cooking tool. It represented continuity, tradition, and the unbroken chain connecting generations of black cooks. Many of these skillets came from mothers who cooked during Jim Crow, from grandmothers who had been sharecroppers, from great-grandmothers who had been enslaved. The skillet survived because it worked, because it was built to last, and because the food cooked in it carried memories that no modern pan could replicate. 2. Corning ware with blue cornflower pattern. The white ceramic dishes with the delicate blue cornflower design were everywhere in black kitchens during the 1970s. These Corning ware casserole dishes could go from freezer to oven to table without breaking, making them perfect for the way black families cooked and entertained. The classic patterns, blue cornflower, spice of life with vegetables, or wildflower, became synonymous with home-cooked comfort food. These dishes carried green bean casseroles to church potlucks, mac and cheese to family reunions, and sweet potato casseroles to Thanksgiving tables. What made Corning ware special was its versatility and durability. Black mothers appreciated that these dishes could withstand the demands of frequent cooking and reheating. The same dish that baked cornbread dressing on Sunday could store leftovers in the refrigerator by Monday and reheat them on Tuesday without any problems. The glass lids allowed you to see what was inside without opening it, keeping the flavors sealed in. These dishes became part of the visual landscape of black hospitality. When someone showed up with a Corning ware dish covered in aluminum foil, you knew real food was inside, not store-bought, not fancy, but made with care and meant to nourish. The dishes themselves became gifts passed between neighbors, lent to family members, and eventually inherited by children who recognized them as symbols of a time when cooking from scratch was not a trend but a way of life. 3. The grease container on the stove. On nearly every black kitchen stove sat a coffee can, small pot, or special container designated for one purpose: collecting bacon grease, cooking oil, and fat drippings. This was not waste, this was liquid gold. After frying chicken, bacon, or pork chops, the hot grease was carefully poured into this container to cool and solidify. Later, that same grease would season collard greens, flavor green beans, or provide the fat needed to make perfect gravy. Nothing went to waste in black households during the 1970s. Saving grease was both practical economics and culinary wisdom passed down through generations. That bacon grease added a depth of flavor to vegetables that butter or oil could never match. It was a secret ingredient that made grandmother's cooking taste different from anyone else's. Children learned to spot the grease container and knew better than to accidentally throw it away or use it for something else. This practice connected directly to Black survival strategies developed during harder times. When resources were limited, when families had to stretch every dollar and use every part of what they had, saving cooking grease was not optional. It was necessary. By the 1970s, many families had more economic stability, but the tradition continued because it worked, because the food tasted better, and because it was a tangible link to ancestors who had taught that nothing with value should ever be wasted. 4. The heavy-duty meat grinder, clamped to the edge of the kitchen table or counter. The manual meat grinder was a fixture in Black households that bought meat in bulk and prepared it themselves. These cast iron or steel grinders, operated by a hand crank, allowed families to grind their own meat for burgers, meatloaf, or sausage. But they served another purpose entirely. During the holidays, especially around Christmas and New Year's, these grinders transformed into the tools for making homemade sausage, a tradition in many Black Southern families. The meat grinder represented self-sufficiency and quality control. Black families who had experienced discrimination in stores or were tired of poor quality meat in their neighborhoods took matters into their own hands. They could buy better cuts directly from butchers they trusted, grind it themselves, and know exactly what was going into their food. The rhythmic sound of the crank turning and meat emerging from the grinder became a familiar soundtrack during meal preparation. Children often took turns cranking the grinder, learning the effort required to prepare food from scratch. It was a lesson in work and tradition, and in the pride that came from making something yourself rather than buying it pre-made. That heavy grinder, stored away for most of the year and brought out for special occasions, symbolized a time when Black families maintained control over their food, their traditions, and their tables. 5. The large pressure cooker. The pressure cooker, with its heavy lid and pressure gauge, was both respected and slightly feared in Black kitchens. This was a tool that could turn tough cuts of meat tender in a fraction of the time, that could cook dried beans without overnight soaking, and that could prepare collard greens or neck bones until they were fall-apart perfect. The sound of the pressure release, that steady hissing that let you know dinner was almost ready, became a comforting signal that good food was coming. Black cooks mastered the pressure cooker out of necessity and skill. Time was always precious when mothers worked long hours outside the home, and the pressure cooker meant weeknight dinners did not have to be rushed or bland. It could transform inexpensive cuts, oxtails, neck bones, ham hocks, into dishes rich with flavor and nutrition. Sunday pot roasts that normally took hours could be ready in time for afternoon dinner, leaving more time for family and less time standing over a hot stove. But the pressure cooker also carried an element of danger that commanded respect. Everyone knew someone whose pressure cooker had malfunctioned, sending food to the ceiling. Black mothers taught their children to stay out of the kitchen when the pressure cooker was working, to never tamper with the pressure valve, and to wait patiently for the pressure to release naturally. It was a powerful tool that, like so much in Black households, required knowledge, respect, and careful attention to use properly. 6. Mason jars for sweet tea. In Black Southern households, sweet tea was not merely a beverage. It was a staple and necessity, a form of hospitality offered to every guest who walked through the door. And that tea was almost always stored in large glass mason jars in the refrigerator. These quart or half-gallon jars, originally designed for canning, found new purpose as the perfect container for brewing and storing sweet tea. The sight of 2 or 3 mason jars filled with dark amber tea, often with lemon slices floating inside, was standard in every Black refrigerator. The process was ritual. Brew the tea strong with several tea bags and boiling water. Add sugar while it was still hot, so it would dissolve completely. Then pour it into the mason jar and fill with cold water. Some families added a pinch of baking soda to cut the bitterness. By afternoon, that jar would be nearly empty, and another would be brewing. On summer days, kids learned to pour their own sweet tea, careful not to get the lemon seeds in their glass. These jars represented Southern Black culture translated into everyday practice. Sweet tea was about hospitality, about always having something to offer visitors, about the small comforts that made a house a home. The mason jars themselves, sturdy, reusable, free if you happen to have them from canning season, embodied the practical wisdom of Black homemakers who found multiple uses for everything they owned. When you saw those jars in the refrigerator, you knew you were in a house where guests were welcome and refreshment was always available. 7. The avocado green or harvest gold refrigerator. The kitchen appliances of the 1970s came in colors that defined the era: avocado green, harvest gold, and burnt orange. Black families who could afford new appliances during this decade often purchased refrigerators and stoves in these trendy shades. These were not just functional appliances, they were status symbol signs that a family had made it, that they could afford something new and modern, that they were part of contemporary American consumer culture. That avocado green refrigerator hummed in the corner, covered with children's artwork held up by magnets, calendars marking important dates, church bulletins, and photographs of family members. The Harvest Gold stove stayed spotless, cleaned after every use, a point of pride for mothers who maintained their homes with fierce dedication despite working full-time jobs. These colorful appliances brightened kitchens and represented progress, a step up from the white appliances of previous decades. For Black families, these purchases carried extra weight. They represented economic advancement in an era when many Black families were experiencing their first taste of middle-class stability. These appliances said, "We have arrived. We can afford nice things. We belong here." The colors might seem dated now, but in the 1970s they were modern, they were stylish, and they were a visible sign of Black achievement and homeownership in an era when both were still relatively new for many families. 8. The electric percolator coffee pot. The morning soundtrack in Black households started with the bubbling rhythm of the electric percolator. These stovetop or electric pots, often made of aluminum or stainless steel, brewed coffee strong and hot, the way Black families preferred it. The distinctive sound, that rhythmic percolating as boiling water cycled to the coffee grounds, meant morning was officially starting, and adults were preparing for the day ahead. Black coffee culture in the 1970s was straightforward. Brew it strong, drink it hot, and keep the pot on all day for anyone who needed a cup. The percolator sat on the stove or counter, plugged in and ready, often making appearance after dinner when company came over. Adults would gather around the kitchen table with their coffee, discussing community matters, sharing neighborhood news, and solving problems while children played nearby. The percolator represented a slower pace, a time before automatic drip machines and pod systems, when making coffee was a process that required attention. Black mothers measured the coffee carefully, filled the pot with cold water, and watched as it began to perk. That first cup poured into heavy ceramic mugs was as much a part of the morning routine as breakfast itself. It was a fuel that powered Black mothers and fathers as they headed out to jobs, managed households, and built better futures for their children. 9. The oversized enamel pot. In every Black kitchen, there was at least one enormous enamel pot, usually white, with black speckles or solid colors like red or blue. These pots were workhorses, large enough to cook for extended families and church gatherings. They boiled dozens of eggs for potato salad, simmered huge batches of collard greens, cooked enough spaghetti to feed a crowd, and made gallons of soup or chili that would last for days. Black families cooked in volume, not just because they had large families, but because feeding others was fundamental to their culture. When someone needed a meal, when unexpected guests arrived, when neighbors were going through hard times, that big pot came out. The enamel exterior might chip over years of use, revealing the metal underneath, but these pots never stopped working. They could withstand high heat, frequent use, and the demands of cooks who were feeding love through food. These pots connected to Black traditions of communal eating and shared resources. They appeared at family reunions, fish fries, church picnics, and neighborhood gatherings. They represented abundance despite limited means, the ability to stretch ingredients through skill and creativity until everyone had enough. That oversized pot sitting on the back burner was always ready to be pressed into service, because in Black households, You never knew when you might need to cook for more than just your immediate family. 10. The cookie tin that never held cookies. Perhaps the most universal experience in Black households of the 1970s was opening a decorative cookie tin, usually Danish butter cookies or some similar imported brand, and finding anything except cookies inside. These metal tins, with their colorful pictures of European scenes or simple floral designs, became the unofficial storage containers for everything from sewing supplies to buttons, to important papers to actual cookies that someone had baked at home. The betrayal of opening that tin expecting cookies and finding thread needles and buttons was a rite of passage for every Black child. But it was also a lesson in resourcefulness. Why throw away a perfectly good metal container when it could serve multiple purposes? The tin kept sewing supplies organized, protected important documents from getting bent, and stored homemade cookies or candies better than plastic bags. It was practical reuse before recycling became trendy. These tins lived in various locations: the kitchen drawer, the bedroom closet, the sewing corner, and each family had several serving different purposes. Some held coupons and recipe clippings. Others contained birthday candles, rubber bands, and twist ties. A few might actually contain cookies, but those were usually stored in the freezer to keep them fresh. The cookie tin that held no cookies became a cultural touchstone, a shared joke across generations of Black families who understood that in their households, things rarely served just one purpose. 11. The wooden cutting board with grooves. The heavy wooden cutting board, worn smooth by decades of use, was where all food preparation happened. These boards, often rectangular and thick, bore the marks of countless meals, knife grooves that told stories, permanent stains from years of chopping onions and raw meat, and surfaces polished by constant scrubbing and drying. Black cooks never used those thin plastic boards that would come later. They had solid wood that could withstand the force of chopping through bones, pounding meat thin, and crushing garlic with the side of a knife. The cutting board lived next to the sink or had a permanent spot on the counter. It was where chickens were broken down, where vegetables were diced for Sunday dinner, where fish were scaled and cleaned, where watermelons were split open on hot summer days. The sound of a sharp knife against that wooden board, the rhythmic chopping that meant food was being prepared with care, was one of the most comforting sounds in a Black kitchen. That board represented skill passed down through demonstration rather than written recipes. Grandmothers taught mothers and mothers taught daughters how to hold a knife properly, how to chop quickly without cutting yourself, how to break down a whole chicken into parts. The board bore witness to this education, to the countless meals prepared on its surface, to the hands that had worked there preparing food that nourished families through celebrations and sorrows alike. 12. The Tupperware cabinet that barely closed. Every Black kitchen had that one cabinet or drawer that could barely close because it was packed with plastic containers, mostly Tupperware, but also margarine tubs, Cool Whip containers, and various other plastic vessels that had been saved and repurposed. Finding a matching lid for a container was like solving a puzzle that rarely worked out. Black mothers prided themselves on never throwing away a good container, and they had systems for storing leftovers that made sense to them even if nobody else could navigate it. The Tupperware itself, with its signature burping seal and pastel colors, was premium storage. Many Black families acquired Tupperware through those legendary home parties where neighbors gathered, socialized, and bought products that promised to keep food fresh longer. But the real stars were the repurposed containers. The Country Crock tub that now held collard greens, the Cool Whip container storing cake frosting, the margarine tubs that went to work or school containing leftovers for lunch. This collection of containers was practical wisdom in action. Why buy expensive storage when perfectly good containers were being thrown away? The margarine tubs sealed just fine, stacked efficiently, and cost nothing. When someone needed to send food home with a relative or give leftovers to neighbors, nobody worried about getting their container back because it had cost nothing. It was a system born of economy, elevated to tradition, and passed down as common sense about not wasting anything useful. 13. The electric hand mixer. The electric hand mixer, usually in that same avocado green or harvest gold color scheme, was an essential tool for Black bakers who made cakes from scratch for every birthday, holiday, and church function. These mixers had two chrome beaters that rotated to cream butter and sugar, whip egg whites to stiff peaks, and mix cake batter until it was perfectly smooth. The sound of those beaters against a metal bowl meant somebody's birthday was coming, or Easter dinner was being prepared, or pound cake was about to go in the oven. Black women took pride in their baking, and the hand mixer made it possible to achieve the light, fluffy textures that made their cakes legendary in their communities. Pound cakes, 7-Up cakes, red velvet cakes, caramel cakes, coconut cakes, all started with that mixer creaming ingredients in a bowl. Children learned to lick the beaters after the batter went into the pan, a small reward for their patience while baking happened. The mixer represented a generation of black homemakers who refused to sacrifice quality despite their busy lives. They could have bought cakes from the store, but homemade meant more. It meant love. It meant tradition. It meant serving something special to people who deserve the best. That hand mixer, stored in its box between uses, was brought out faithfully for every occasion that required a cake made with care. 14. The wall-mounted can opener, bolted to the wall or the side of a cabinet. The manual can opener was a permanent fixture in black kitchens. This heavy-duty metal device had a cutting wheel and a crank handle, and it could open any size can with efficiency. Black cooks who were opening multiple cans of vegetables for large family dinners appreciated that the wall-mounted opener was always in the same spot, always ready, and nearly indestructible. The steady grinding sound of that opener working through a can lid was part of dinner preparation. It meant green beans from the can were about to be transformed with bacon grease and seasonings. It meant tomato sauce was being opened for spaghetti. It meant evaporated milk was about to go into sweet potato pie. The wall-mounted opener was faster and easier than the handheld versions, leaving hands free to catch the lid before it fell into the can. These openers lasted forever, passing from one decade to the next without failing. They represented a time when kitchen tools were built to last, when families expected to use the same equipment for years without replacement. That opener, often painted over multiple times as kitchens were redecorated but still functioning perfectly underneath, was a small but essential part of making sure that food preparation happened efficiently in households where time was always precious. 15. The metal colander with feet. The large metal colander, usually aluminum or enamel-coated steel with handles on both sides and small feet that lifted it off the counter, was essential for draining everything from pasta to vegetables to freshly washed greens. These colanders had dozens of small holes that allowed water to rush through while keeping food secure inside. In black kitchens, the colander worked overtime, draining spaghetti for quick weeknight dinners, rinsing collard greens leaf by leaf, and cleaning fresh vegetables brought home from the market. The sound of water streaming through the colander into the sink signaled different stages of meal preparation. It meant pasta was ready to be tossed with sauce, or greens had been properly washed and were ready for the pot, or potatoes had been boiled and needed draining for mashing. The colander's design, with those sturdy handles and stable feet, made it easy to work with even when it was full and heavy. That colander served families for decades, developing a patina of age that somehow made it work even better. It went to family reunions to drain pounds of potato salad potatoes. It appeared at church fish fries. It was an unglamorous but essential tool that black cooks relied on daily, trusting it to perform the simple but necessary task of separating food from water so that cooking could continue. 16. The aluminum foil storage system. Aluminum foil in black households of the 1970s served far more purposes than merely covering food. Every black kitchen had a system, usually a drawer or cabinet, packed with aluminum foil, plastic wrap, wax paper, and an assortment of food storage supplies. But aluminum foil was the star, used to cover dishes going into the oven, wrap leftovers, create packets for steaming fish, line baking pans for easier cleanup, and cover foods at church potlucks. The heavy-duty aluminum foil was preferred because it held up better to repeated use. Yes, repeated use. Black families washed and reused aluminum foil if it was not too soiled. A piece of foil that had simply covered a dish could be washed, dried, and used again. This was not poverty but practical economy, part of a larger philosophy about not wasting resources. That drawer full of aluminum foil, plastic wrap, and sandwich bags represented preparedness for any food storage or cooking need that might arise. When food was being sent home with family members or taken to a gathering, dishes were covered in aluminum foil, sometimes 2 or 3 layers for extra security. The foil kept food hot, protected it during transport, and could be disposed of afterward, saving the worry about getting dishes back. It was simple, effective, and universal in Black kitchens where feeding others and sharing food was a fundamental expression of love. 17. The Pyrex Mixing Bowl Set. The nested set of Pyrex mixing bowls, clear glass with measurements marked on the side, was essential equipment in Black kitchens where cooking and baking happened regularly. These bowls came in different sizes, from small for beating eggs to large for mixing cake batter or tossing salad. The clear glass allowed cooks to see ingredients as they mixed, and the bowls were heavy enough to stay stable during vigorous stirring. Black cooks appreciated that Pyrex bowls were durable, heat-resistant, and easy to clean. The same bowl that mixed batter could be placed in the refrigerator to chill pie filling or used to marinate meat overnight. The bowls stacked neatly, saving cabinet space in kitchens that often had more tools than storage. Over the years, these bowls witnessed thousands of meals being prepared. Holiday dinners, birthday cakes, weeknight side dishes, and everything in between. The Pyrex bowls represented quality investment in kitchen equipment. They were not cheap, but they lasted forever and performed reliably. For Black families building their households, buying good equipment that would last was important. Those bowls became part of the kitchen infrastructure, as essential as pots and pans, trusted tools that made cooking easier and more efficient. 18. The Dish Drying Rack. The metal or plastic dish drying rack, positioned permanently next to the sink, was where every dish, pot, and utensil went after being hand-washed. In an era before dishwashers were common in Black households, that drying rack was in constant use. It had spaces for plates to stand vertically, compartments for utensils, and room for cups and bowls. By evening, after dinner dishes were washed, that rack would be full, and dish towels would be draped over chairs to dry. Washing dishes by hand was not just a chore, it was a time when families talked, when mothers and daughters had conversations, when children learned responsibility by drying and putting away dishes. The sound of water running, dishes clinking, and the squeak of a clean dish being wiped dry was a soundtrack of evening routines in Black households. The drying rack held the evidence of meals shared, of families fed, of daily life continuing. That simple rack represented the rhythms of Black domestic life in the 1970s, when convenience appliances were still luxuries many families could not afford. It represented the labor of Black women who worked outside the home all day and still came home to cook, clean, and care for their families. The dish rack, humble and utilitarian, was a silent witness to the incredible work Black mothers did to maintain homes and nurture families, often with limited resources but unlimited dedication. 19. The Spice Rack with Basic Seasonings. The spice rack in Black kitchens during the 1970s was not elaborate, but it held the essential seasonings that made everything taste better. Salt, black pepper, garlic powder, onion powder, seasoning salt, paprika, and maybe cayenne pepper for those who liked heat. These spices, often stored in matching jars or the original tins from brands like McCormick or Lawry's, sat on a small rack on the counter or hung on the wall, always within reach while cooking. Black cooks knew that proper seasoning made the difference between ordinary food and memorable meals. Garlic powder and onion powder went into almost everything. Seasoning salt, especially Lawry's, was a shortcut to making food taste good without measuring multiple spices. Paprika gave color to deviled eggs and potato salad. Black pepper was used generously, unlike the timid sprinkles in many mainstream American kitchens. This basic spice collection represented the foundation of Black seasoning wisdom. Black cooks did not need dozens of exotic spices to make food delicious. They needed salt, pepper, garlic, and onion, plus the skill to use them properly. That small spice rack held the building blocks of flavors that made Black cooking distinct. Food that had soul and character. food that people requested at gatherings because they knew it would taste like home. 20. The tea kettle on the stove. The tea kettle, usually stainless steel or enamel-coated metal, sat on the back burner of the stove, ready to boil water at a moment's notice. In black households, hot water was needed constantly, for instant coffee, for tea, for hot cocoa on cold mornings, for dissolving Jell-O, for warming baby bottles, for countless other purposes throughout the day. The whistle of that kettle, announcing that water had reached a full boil, was one of the most familiar sounds in the house. The kettle represented a slower, more deliberate approach to hot beverages. Instead of microwaving water or using an electric kettle, families boiled water properly in the kettle, waiting for that whistle, then carefully pouring it over tea bags or instant coffee. The ritual of preparing hot drinks was part of the comfort, the waiting, the whistle, the careful pouring, the first sip of something warm and comforting. That kettle, often showing signs of age with slight discoloration from years of use, was another piece of kitchen equipment that lasted virtually forever. It required no electricity, no special maintenance, just water and heat. It worked as reliably on its 10,000th use as it had on its first. For black families, that reliability mattered. It was another small thing they could count on in a world that did not always feel stable or welcoming. These 20 kitchen items were never just tools. They were the infrastructure of black family life, the equipment that made it possible to feed families with limited budgets, to maintain traditions passed down through generations, to create the meals that defined black culture and comfort. Every cast iron skillet, every mason jar of sweet tea, every repurposed margarine container represented practical wisdom developed through necessity and perfected through practice. In these kitchens, black mothers worked miracles daily, transforming modest ingredients into feasts, feeding not just their immediate families but extended relatives, neighbors, and anyone who needed a meal. The tools in these kitchens were chosen for durability, versatility, and value. Nothing was purchased frivolously, nothing was wasted, and everything served multiple purposes when possible. Looking back at these items is not just nostalgia. It is recognition of the incredible skill, resourcefulness, and love that characterized black households in the 1970s. These kitchens produced more than food. They produced memories, traditions, and the strength that carried families through challenging times. The next time you see a cast iron skillet or a mason jar of sweet tea, remember that these simple items represent a rich heritage of black culinary excellence and family resilience that continues to influence American food culture today.